Welcome to C-Suite Blueprint Radio, conversations with communications strategy consultant and author Ed Barks and his guests. C-Suite Blueprint Radio serves as a practical resource for senior communications and government relations executives who counsel their C-Suite leaders. Our goal? To help you achieve your business and public policy goals. Now, here's your host, Ed Barks.
Reporters under attack. Unfounded allegations of fake news, journalism's reputation bottoming out. What are legitimate news outlets to do? Well, that's where the National Press Club Journalism Institute comes into play. Today on C-Suite Blueprint Radio, we talk with Julie Moos, the Institute's Executive Director. The organization advocates for a free press by educating reporters, offering scholarships, and operating the Eric Friedheim National Journalism Library. One of its latest initiatives is the establishment of a fallen journalist memorial honoring those who died while performing their jobs. It's a pleasure to have Julie Moos with us on C-Suite Blueprint Radio. Julie, welcome.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, Ed.
You're welcome. To start off, give us a quick take on what press freedom means and why it's important to the average citizen.
That's a great question. Press freedom is the way that we, as a democracy, are informed and able to engage civically so that we know both what our government is doing on our behalf and what our role is in holding them accountable. And it's, enshrined in the First Amendment and one of the aspects of a sacred trust between the media and the communities that we serve.
And what are some of today's really burning front burner press freedom issues in your mind?
Well, we obviously saw a devastating attack on the Capitol last week. We saw Murder the Media appearing on a door very prominently. We saw a New York Times photographer surrounded and threatened, CNN reporters surrounded and threatened, Washington Post journalists arrested. And none of that happened in a vacuum. It's certainly part of a larger environment in which hate has been unleashed. However, it's also a response to a president who, while he was able to post on Twitter, posted 2,520 tweets degrading journalists and the media as a whole, according to the Press Freedom Tracker. So that's, clearly the imminent physical danger that those journalists faced and that many other journalists faced is one of the pressing concerns right now. There also are journalists like Maria Ressa, who is one of our Obeshon honorees, who's fighting bogus charges in the Philippines. Journalists like Linda Tirado, who was another Obeshon honoree who is blind in one eye and will be after a police projectile hit her while covering protests in Minneapolis after George Floyd was killed by officers there. We have journalists detained in China and around the world for doing their jobs, even though journalism is not a crime. And of course, 32 journalists were killed last year for doing their jobs. So it's a more dire situation than it has been ever before.
You mentioned something called an Obeshon honoree. What's that?
The press club every year honors a few journalists, one domestically and one overseas, who represent the struggles of press freedom. And it is named in honor of a press club president who was a fierce advocate for press freedom, John Obeshon.
You mentioned also in your comments, Julie, that the Washington Post reporter was arrested during the Capitol invasion. That's something that even as a loyal reader of the Washington Post, I must say I was unaware of. How much of this really goes on that the general public does not know about?
That's a great question. Actually, quite a bit. And there have been more journalists detained, not always arrested, in the United States in the last probably 6 months, since June and the protests, than I've seen at any other time. And I've been reporting on media off and on for, about 15 years now. So a lot of it goes on in the shadows, both literally and metaphorically. And because journalists are trained to not make themselves the story, it often gets either underreported or is not reported at all.
And while we're on the topic of the January 6th invasion of the Capitol by domestic terrorists, and for our listeners, we are recording this shortly after, about 1 week after that invasion occurred. How does that change how reporters have to go about their jobs?
Well, I think there's been, clearly an increase in security around journalists who are in the field. And that's been true for local television stations and for, national reporters who are going perhaps in places they don't typically and who find a local fixer or who are contracting with security agencies. Understandably, news organizations don't want to talk about the precautions they're taking, but they increased dramatically after the June 2018 murder of 5 people at the Capitol Gazette newsroom. So, newsrooms looked then, sadly, at their own access in the building. Could anybody get in? Were the key cards, at whether they had bulletproof glass, if they were in studios, broadcast studios that were sort of open to a street, and again started looking increasingly at how they were keeping people safe. There also was a very tragic death of Allison Parker, and the person who was with her, whose name I don't recall, I'm sorry, in Virginia, that they were live reporting as well, and lost their lives because of violence. So I think many, if not all, news organizations have been looking at this much more closely in the last 2 to 4 years, and certainly in the last few weeks, if they hadn't before then. And at the same time, you have this tremendous commitment on the part of photojournalists who have to get very, very close to potential threats in order to be our eyes. And there's obviously a great commitment on the part of journalists to be the public's proxy. And so in the end, there's only so much you can do if you're really committed to doing that work.
And I want to follow up in a moment on the photojournalist that you mentioned, the photojournalist aspect of this. First, a quick reminder for our listeners to keep up with the latest in communications strategy and training. Become a member of the communications community. When you sign up at www.barkscom.com, you receive a checklist making you eligible to receive our Insider Strategies resources that offer advice on dealing with the media, speaking in public, and advocating before policymakers. You'll also receive twice monthly emails to help you sharpen your communications edge. Just visit www.barkscom.com. That's BARKSCOMM.com, and tell us where to send it. Join the community today. Back now with Julie Moos of the National Press Club Journalism Institute. And Julie, you touched on a point that I know I often forget, and I'm sure many of our listeners do too, that we're not just talking about reporters who are broadcasting on TV or radio, or journalists who are writing for print publications, but photojournalists too. And I imagine they face some very special concerns that their colleagues may not face in quite the depth that they do.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, we started to see this become more visible as COVID arrived and spread, because while reporters can make phone calls from home and write on their laptops from home, photojournalists can't do their work from home. They have to be out where people are. And so it's much more dangerous for them. There were a lot of issues early on in making sure that they have had the personal protective equipment that they needed in order to stay safe. And I know the National Press Photographers Association was very helpful in trying to make sure that they got what they needed. And then, of course, in really any circumstance, in any crisis, in any breaking news, and certainly we saw this last week at the Capitol, they are on the front lines. They are close in. And they cannot hide their job. Not that reporters are necessarily hiding their notepads, but it is a potentially more discreet type of work. if you're a photographer or a videographer, your camera is visible. And so people know, and sometimes it has the name of your news organization on it. We saw at the Capitol that the Associated Press's video team had their equipment damaged, possibly destroyed. And, again, it was in part because you could see that they were journalists. It was apparent. The New York Times photographer who was surrounded and attacked, they took one of her cameras. And then later, when the Capitol Police or law enforcement, I'm not positive if it was the Capitol Police, saw her without her equipment, they didn't know she was a photographer, and they thought she was potentially a threat. And it took other photographers standing up and saying, no, she had her camera stolen. She is not a threat here. She's actually a victim. So it's a very tenuous situation. And yet we saw the power of the images they delivered to us last week. We saw the person hanging in the Senate gallery. We saw them up on the podium. We saw events unfold because of their eyes and their willingness to risk their own safety and well-being on our behalf.
Julie, a lot of our listeners are on the communications side of the equation. In other words, they're those folks who deal with reporters day in, day out. What is the responsibility of communicators in the realm of press freedom?
That's a great question. I mean, I think ethical information spreaders have more in common than we do have things that divide us, whatever their role in an organization. And
it was interesting that the one of the Forbes editors said if any company that hires any of the Trump communications people, Forbes would automatically assume that they are being told lies. Mm-hmm. Does that feed into what you were talking about?
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting too. I'm glad you brought that up. So I mean, ethical, accurate information spreading is something that that the best communicators do and that the best journalists do. And so, so it is really helpful to see things like what Forbes did, kind of bring that together and say, whether you're a commentator being hired to do that, if you came out of a administration or specifically a background yourself of being dishonest and deceptive about information, then I'm going to assume that you're being dishonest and deceptive about information. If you're an organization that enables that, then that creates credibility problems all around. I think it's part of increasingly a reality that you cannot segregate either people's past behavior from their present, and also that you can't assume that there is some protective neutrality that negates somehow, racism. That there's not or hate or spreading information that is intended to incite hate. That is no longer sort of a default, I think, lens for people, both in newsrooms and in other forms of communication.
Julie, I want to give you a moment to talk about what I understand is one of the National Press Club Journalism Institute's main initiatives these days, and that's the Fallen Journalist Memorial. Tell us about it. Where will it be? What will it look like? And what is its status now?
Thanks for asking about that. So I wish I could tell you where it'll be and what it'll look like. Those are very much to be determined. However, the really wonderful press freedom news that came at the very end of 2020 is that President Trump actually signed into law the Fallen Journalist Memorial Act, which passed unanimously through the House and the Senate and authorizes a permanent place in Washington, D.C. to honor journalists who have lost their lives in service to democracy. It begins a 7-year process during which we will work with design firms and with site selection committees and with fundraisers in order to start turning that into a reality. We're really thrilled, though, that there's been this bipartisan, bicameral support for it, and we're about to start to get to work with all of the other things that need to happen now.
Julie, where can listeners learn more about the National Press Club Journalism Institute, and what's the best way for listeners to get in touch with you with any questions?
The best way to learn about the Institute is through our website, pressclubinstitute.org. That's pressclubinstitute.org. And the best way to get in touch with me is by email. You can just send an email to institute@press.org. That's institute@press.org.
Thanks very much to Julie Moos, Executive Director of the National Press Club Journalism Institute, for joining us on C-Suite Blueprint Radio. This is Ed Barks. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to C-Suite Blueprint Radio with Ed Barks. Check out the show notes on the C-Suite Blueprint blog. While you're there, comment on this episode by sharing your thoughts in the Leave a Reply box. To learn how Ed can help you reach your business and public policy goals, visit barkscom.com. That's BARKSCOMM.com. Tune in again soon here on C-Suite Blueprint Radio.